Welcome back to episode 289 of the Tallboy Radio Podcast. And as we always say, who knows where it goes when the beer flows? Well, tonight we've got a treat for you. You got the folks from Tallboy Radio who have brought a Phillips screwdriver and a pencil to a gunfight. So, yeah, we have invited Shiner from the Tiddy and Shiner show on to talk about the Second Amendment. Say hello, dude, and tell us a little bit about the Tiddy and Shiner show.
Well, thanks for having me, man. And yeah, I'm half of the duo that is the Tiddy and Shiner show. And we have a show. Back in the day, it started, and we came from actually another podcast that we left and started our own. And it was at the beginning, it was all about current events and times and just things that have happened. We've kind of been pushed into a pretty politically opinionated podcast at this point. I mean, there's times we get on the mics and we're like, hey, let's just not do the politics thing tonight. But it always ends up sucking us back in. But yeah, if you guys don't listen to us, we can be found just about everywhere that you can find a podcast. And it's worth giving a listen to and hear our opinions about things. So. But that's it. Yeah, that's who I am. That's what I'm about, bud. We've been fans of the Tallboy guys since they started this whole project. So we go back a ways.
We do. And like we said in episode 1, this, it was the Tiddy and Shiner show that inspired us to start our podcast. We still hope just to peak there with the Ashton good self. And be up there with you.
Oh man, we're super grateful for when you guys mention us, and like we're glad to be part of you guys launching that project for sure, because you guys have really kicked it in the ass. And yeah, it's cool to see what you guys have made this grow into for sure.
Indeed, and we can undo some of that good work tonight. So yeah. I wanted to do a podcast, as I was just explaining there in the green room at the start. We're based over here in the UK. Gun laws are very, very different, obviously, in terms of you pretty much. I actually started Googling what you would have to do to go about and get a gun in the UK, because I didn't know, which is probably not really something you want in your search history. But nonetheless, I needed to know the answer to those questions. I'm still not 100% sure, to tell you the truth. Over there in the US, it's a little bit different. And by all accounts, there's opposition to gun ownership over there. But for the most part, it's certainly in the states, the southern part of the US, guns are very, very popular. I read somewhere that there are 120 guns per 100 people. You know what I mean? And when
I would believe that.
Yeah, when you bear in mind that only 30% of Americans allegedly are listed as a gun, that basically means a lot of people own a lot of guns. So tell us about it from your perspective, dude. Tell us, what does the Second Amendment mean to you?
People, and you're right. There is a contingency of people here that don't like the Second Amendment, and they have done everything they can to limit that amendment as much as they can. And there's constantly court battles going on here about that. But I was raised in a house. My dad was a police officer. His dad was a police officer. So I was just by default, I was raised around firearms, and so it gives me a perspective. I don't have any other perspective than being around people that believe in the Second Amendment. And to us, I know I can't speak for Tiddy per se, but I know the direction he feels on things. And like the Second Amendment to me is, everybody will say that our First Amendment is the most important, piece of literature in the Constitution. And I would agree with that in a lot of aspects, but I think the Second Amendment is just as important. Like that one, and it was instilled, it was put there because we had a problem with you guys and they were trying to do things to make it so that citizens could defend themselves against tyranny. And they felt like they had been victims of tyranny. They didn't want that to happen to other people. And they looked at that as like, that's a God-given inalienable right to own a firearm to protect yourself. And, the people that are against the Second Amendment here, they like to preach a lot about the Second Amendment. They wrote that so people could have firearms to hunt and provide for their families. When in actuality, if you read it, it has nothing to do with hunting. It is all about defending yourself against tyranny and in the powers that be, if they're imposing these things on you. So that's the problem. And I do think at times we see our federal government, depending on who's in office, will whittle away at that Second Amendment and our right. And there, we have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms here, and they enforce all these ridiculous laws that have been passed. And I mean, some of them they just don't make, not even on paper, they make sense. It's just for a way for them to kind of harass you. And so, I get people, and that's what you and I were talking about. Is I've always wondered what this perspective was from outside the United States, because I'm sure you guys see the school shootings we have and the murders. We have an incredible amount of people that are killed with guns every year. I get it, but do you guys look at us as just kind of like the Wild West, and just hooting, tooting, stick shooters everywhere? And
I'm sure there are folks out there that do look at the US like that. I wouldn't say I was one of them. I think most folks who visited American cities and, can see that it doesn't, it isn't lawless, in many ways. And it was mind blowing to be in Texas and see people walking around with sidearms on, because the previous places I visited in America, like more recently being New York and Las Vegas. Obviously, Vegas, you're on the strip, you can't take a gun anywhere on the strip,
right?
And then obviously New York, certainly when I was last there, I don't know if it's changed now, but you certainly can't walk around with a pistol on your hip. Whereas Texas, we asked a guy to take a photograph of us, and there he was, with his huge the hand cannon on, strapped to his hip. We're like, wife didn't even notice. Interestingly enough, I was like, wow. That's quite a piece. But it's mad to see. But I'll be honest with you, at no point did I feel unsafe around any of these people. You could see people, carrying guns in the town. I was like, I didn't feel unsafe. And I'd be interested to know this. So you grew up in a household where, like you say, the son of a police officer was the son of a police officer. So you'd seen guns, you're aware of it. Now, time before last, I was in Texas. So we took some guns out to the field to shoot them on a range. So I had to go with an assault rifle and I had to go with a pistol. Now the pistol didn't have a safety on it. So literally,
okay.
So my cousin handed it to me first. I held it like I was holding a puffer fish. You had it by the tail. He's like, "No, dude, no, you grip it. You own that. Pistol.
Yeah."
I guess that's because the only other times I fired a firearm then have been on gun ranges when I visited Vegas, and it's a very, very different affair. It's a controlled environment.
Yes.
And so to be out there and you're in the middle of a field with just two other guys, and and all of a sudden you've got this thing that is incredibly dangerous in your hand. I had the ultimate respect for it, but you know what I mean? I wasn't grabbing it, I wasn't owning it. So I'll be interested to learn a bit about yourself and how you grew up learning to respect firearms.
Yeah, when my dad got on the police department just a few months before I was born. So literally from the moment I entered the world, I was around guns. And as I got older, of course, my dad being a police officer, I mean, he was like my superhero, so I wanted to be just like him. And once I got old enough that I kind of started getting my mom could tell I was developing an interest, because he'd come home and just take his gun belt off and lay it in a chair and, go sleep for the day, and it'd just be out there. And so my mom would kind of watch me. And once I started I was probably 3 years old. And she told me, he's kind of getting where that's catching his attention. So next time he had days off, he took me out to a piece of property out away from the city. And he had 5 milk jugs filled with water. And he takes me back about probably, 15 yards from him. And he has me stand next to him. And he never told me to put my hands over my ears or anything, And he throws this revolver up and he cranks a round off and shoots that milk jug, and water. I mean, it explodes and water goes everywhere. And he looked down at me and he said, "If you ever touch this when I'm not around you and it goes off, it could do that to you." And dude, that was imprinted right in that moment, like it was so real to me. So I never had a fascination. I just knew if I ever wanted to check it out, like I remember when I got to a little bit older, they went from using revolvers to semi-automatic pistols, and I thought that was really cool. But I knew I couldn't go over there and mess with it until he was with me, and he was real good about it. Like I went to him and said, "Hey, Dad, can you show me that new gun you got?" And he took all the time I wanted with him, and showed it to me. But I always knew like that was just not something a child was supposed to touch, with them out an adult around. But for my brother and I had friends that would come in the house, and my dad's gun rig would be laying around. And my mom would tell us, you got to really watch those boys and my brother had a friend in particular, we really had to watch him because to this day, I believe if we ever turned our back on him at the same time, he'd have taken that gun and he probably would have shot one of us. Like guns were such a taboo in his house. His fascination with them was to like a super unhealthy level, and like, we always talk about, I bet he grew up and like committed a mass shooting somewhere, but like, I just had respect. Got older, and pretty soon I was big enough that I could hold a revolver up, and my dad took me out and taught me how to shoot it, taught me how to clean a gun, and he instilled the responsibility in gun ownership in me from the jump. I mean, that he always pounded that in my head, and so I just always had this reverent respect for firearms. I just knew how they were to be treated, and I was also, I ended up becoming a sheriff's deputy when I got older, but I was also brought up around my dad and the SWAT team, and I learned about home defense and how to use them in those situations, and, when's appropriate and when's not appropriate. And, we do have a lot of irresponsible gun owners in the United States, obviously, from the amount of murders we have that are committed with them,
I mean, and that you brought it up there, dude. In terms of the murder rates, there's a massive distance between what happens in the US and what happens in the UK. Now, some people would point to guns was the problem, but the bottom line is, I'm guessing if a gun effect just exacerbates the situation or expedites the situation. You know what I mean? If someone's going to go and take somebody's life, then there's a danger that they're going to do that regardless. However, given something that is as easy as just literally you pointed at somebody and pull the trigger without any consequence, there's no real ability to fight off somebody who's doing something like that, even with a Phillips screwdriver.
Right. Yeah.
It's big to put it on your podcast. Yeah. I mean, that I don't know. Why is the murder rate so high then in the US?
It's I do think, there, and I can't deny it. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. There is a problem. Illegal guns are a huge problem here. I mean, so they're always talking about all these laws to make it more stringent to be able to make it more stringent in regard to getting our hands on new firearms or transferring firearms between people. And they try to make it incredibly difficult, but it seems like, they lose sight of criminals don't do things by the law. Like they don't care what you pass, So I know that guns contribute to the murder rate, but I listened to a talk my dad gave one time, and he made this statement, we could take guns out of the country. We could pass laws and make that happen. But if somebody, he kind of said what you alluded to, if somebody has it in their mind, they're going to do harm to another person, especially if they have it in their mind, they're going to take that person's life. It could be a gun, but my dad goes, I can go down to the hardware store and buy a hammer and turn it into an assault hammer real fast, And so I think I've always kind of, in the past few years, our biggest problem here is mental health. That contributes, and we don't have enough checks in place as far as people's mental health is concerned when they buy firearms. And they're trying to change that, and they should change that, It's a real weird thing here because we have a law that protects our privacy as far as our health records go, but they're going to have to get in those health records to see if you've had a history of mental health issues. I'm sorry, but I feel like I get privacy. I'm one of the biggest proponents of it, but that would save lives. And so I'm definitely for that. But yeah, it's hard for me to relate to people that aren't pro Second Amendment. Like I have a hard time understanding them. Like I just don't get it. And I'm not saying, I believe we not like you guys. You guys' law is you just can't have firearms at all, right?
more or less. Like I said, I was Googling it the other day, and yeah, you can own a firearm here. However, it is not a right; it is a privilege. You have to absolutely categorically prove that you can own one in terms of that you are, I believe, mentally able to do so. But you also have to have a purpose for it. Now, you can't own handguns. You can't own anything above a .22 rifle. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, so you can basically you can have a shotgun and a few other, maybe a few other things, but certainly definitely no handguns. Now, you would have to jump through a whole load of loops. So in terms of, I had a quick look at the stats over here. So gun-related homicides are still a thing in the UK, and you would say, I mean, I was surprised it was as many as it was. So
Really?
30 to 50 a year in terms of homicides. Okay, 30 to 50 a year. Now, I know that pales into insignificance when you look at the States. However, when you think in the UK, I literally don't know anybody who owns a gun.
Right.
I find that mind blowing. The fact there's one a week, and then on top of that, there is a number of suicides as well. So 50 to 70 gun related suicides in the UK. So it's the problem is there. It's a much smaller problem, but I'm not gonna I'm not gonna say it's not there, because that would be disrespectful to anybody who's ever lost a loved one to in the
Right.
UK. To a gun
That
related
is
crime.
surprising, though. That seems like a very high number. I would assume that would have been a much lower number than that, based on how strict your gun laws are.
Yeah. So I was looking to when they were tightened up. So we mentioned the horror of school shootings earlier. So
Yes.
way back in 1998 was the last significant, well, it's described as significant. If it happened again since then, I apologize for that statement. But the last significant gun shooting in a school in the UK, and I think there was 18 people killed, and it was Dunblane, and everybody still talks about that to this day.
Really? But it was that long ago.
Yeah, in 1998 was the last one. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the world of tennis, but Andy Murray, being one of our famous tennis players, yeah, so he was at that school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he had to take cover in I think in the gym, so it says. So it's probably still talked about a little bit, because obviously very famous person went there, but it is still quite shocking. Now, I must admit, so my company we were opening up offices in Denver, in Colorado, and there was a possibility for a time that maybe there was an option to go out and work there for myself. Didn't happen, as it turns out. I said to the missus, this is the opportunity. I've always wanted to move to the States, so I put on America from the Air for her. Okay. So watch this. It looks amazing. So I'd watch the stuff. It shows it comes in the Rocky Mountains and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It doesn't know what's there. It's like, look, this is a piece of natural history. It is beautiful. Then it goes to Columbine High School. Oh, right. This is not selling it. This is not selling it.
I haven't looked statistics up in quite a while, but I'm gonna go ahead and safely make the statement that the United States has got to lead the world in school shootings. And I don't know why we have so many of them, bro, that there's been some of them take place that are never even reported on. Yeah. Depending on the backstory behind it and who committed it and who they're associated with, and it won't even be talked about. And I think, how disrespectful is that? It's a horrible plague on the United States. Thank God there hasn't been a tremendous amount of them, probably just a handful that law enforcement officers have had to engage the shooters and unfortunately take their life. And thank God for that, man. Cause they're kids. We had a horrible incident. I can't, don't quote me on this, but I think it was in Missouri, and two little boys they were probably 10, maybe not even that old, maybe 8, but they had found two pistols of one of the little boys' dads, and they'd been out in the yard pointing them at cars that were going by. Well, somebody called the police, and they hear about a kid in the street with a gun. They're rolling over there with sirens blaring. The little kids hear them, and they run in the house and lock the door and barricade themselves. Well, it ends up being a standoff, and the SWAT team is called out, and they had the body cam footage, and these poor officers, man, they show up at the door, and as soon as they're not even on the porch of this house, and the door flies open, and those little boys are standing there, and both of them raise those pistols up and point them at those officers, and horribly those officers had to shoot those little boys. And I told Titty, I can't imagine the trauma those two officers are going to deal with the rest of their life. Like that, what a horrible situation. And there was a big, of course, and probably rightfully so, there was a big anti-gun push after that, but it goes back to responsibility. Like those little boys shouldn't have been able to have access to those guns, that they definitely shouldn't have been able to get a hold of them and tote them around. So it falls on the gun owner himself, but and that's the juxtaposition of it is like, I believe so firmly in the Second Amendment, but I also see how people can take that right and manipulate it and use it for, evil things. And so it's a real weird dichotomy, in my head a lot of times.
Yeah. I think that's the whole point about this, isn't it? And this is why these things are important to talk about. Over in the UK, like I say, we can't get a head around it because the way we dealt with it was literally right. Nobody has a gun. The US, that isn't going to work because, like we said, just how many guns are out there in circulation, how many are registered, how many aren't registered. The bottom line is you take the guns, take the registered guns off the honest people. You're leaving dishonest folks with guns, and
that's exactly it.
That isn't going to improve the situation any. So that's the concern. So that's how we've dealt with it in the UK. And truthfully, when you look at things like the school shootings that have happened in the US, I've wanted to move to the States for a long, long time. Now I've got 2 kids, 8 and 6, and if I'm going to be honest, the one thing that stopped me from moving out there is the wife. And the wife, because of that's her chief concern, that she knows in the UK here we can send our kids to school, and God willing, touch wood, nothing's going to happen to them. We can't, it's not guaranteed because you mentioned on your podcast, we've got enough issues with knives in this country right now. I was looking at after you mentioned that on your podcast, I had a look at the size of the problem, and it's a big problem.
It's a significant issue.
Yeah, it is. But if it wasn't for that, I do believe, maybe I'll be drinking PBR out there,
Well, and what the crazy thing is, like my son is 30 years old now. Like when I was sending him to school, this wasn't a concern that you ever dealt with. Like we weren't to that point in our progression here. Like, and now, I was Titty and I were talking about this on the phone one day. I said, dude, how sad is this? I said, the nurse showed me an email that a company had sent her, and they sell body armor. And she said, look at this. I hadn't even thought about something like this. One of the products they market is a ballistic insert to put in your child's backpack to send them to school with. And I told Titty, how sad is it that we are to that point as a society? You gotta, make sure your kids are ballistically protected to go to school. That's insane. I mean,
it's something I don't have to think about, and I don't want to think about. So I totally take my wife's point of view on that one. But like I say, these folks like yourself who are brought up with respect for firearms, is it something that is taught in school? Is it something? I mean, the idea of taking a gun into school obviously is a bad idea for the most part. But is that something that needs educate? And then, let's face it. Also, I'm not going to put it on the schools because it ain't just the school's job to educate your child; it's yours as well. Like you say, you educate your son. Your dad educated you in it.
Mm-hmm.
I do my best to. I don't know what I teach my kids. To be fair, it's probably the best not to go down that path. But how much of a difference would that make if everybody was educated? Would that, like you say, mental health thing, taking that apart? Because, like you say,
well, the crazy thing is, like when I was young, like I was probably on the tail end of it, but during our physical education class, when you were in grade school, they taught you gun safety. They had all these air rifles they'd bring out, and they teach you, and kids that, I grew going to, that young, I went to a public school that it was kind of in a rural town, and we had, all those kids grew up around guns. Like, you grow up on a ranch, and your dad puts a 22 rifle in your arms as soon as you can hold it up to shoot coyotes and stuff with. They all knew what they were doing, but I didn't even realize until my son was in school that at some point they phased that out and quit doing that. And it probably would be beneficial, but now things are so wild in our schools. Like, I'd be scared to get a box of air rifles out, high powered air rifles, and divvy them up among the kids, because these kids are just crazy over here anymore. Like, I think it would be different though if we could find a way to teach more of them respect. Like when I was a sheriff's deputy, I'd encounter kids on the streets that were 12 years old running around with a pistol in their waistband. Like, I know you don't have the respect for this that you should, and you probably don't even know that much about it other than pulling the trigger. And that's the dangerous thing. Like, people that have them that don't know anything about them, it goes back to that responsibility that my dad instilled in me, and as I got older, I realized if you're going to own these things, not only do you need to be proficient with it, you need to be the best you can possibly be with it. Like, that's your responsibility, and kind of like, hey, thanks for letting me own this. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to become as proficient as I possibly can with this thing and be as safe as I possibly can with this. There's just so many people that don't look at it that way, and that's unfortunate. I mean,
no, I know what you're saying, and certainly I tell my kids about this. So when we talk about, respect, and certainly smacking as it is now, that isn't allowed. So when I tell my kids about it, I don't smack my kids, I don't hit my kids. So some days they do push me to the brink, but I have never done it. But when I was at school, the cane was allowed. Okay, I am that old. By my grey whiskers, we banned the cane, and I don't know what it was, my 70s or 80s, I forget what it was, but I am that old. So basically, and you could whack, the teacher was allowed to whack you. You've been out of line. When they banned it, my mum sent a letter into the school and said, look, my boys get out of hand, feel free to whack them on. You got my permission. It works, and it keeps them in line. And I tell you what, I was still an asshole at school. I was not as bad as my brother, but I could be a little bit lippy. And yeah, I did get smacked quite a few times, but I can tell you this much: I never once did I get it when I didn't deserve it. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's for certain. Yeah, like, we've talked on our show about, like, that was the standing rule where we grew up in our neighborhood. My brother and I were just 3 years apart, and we were just little assholes. And literally kind of pyromaniacs. I mean, we were known for setting stuff on fire and the fire department showing up and putting it out. And and my mom told everybody in the neighborhood, like, my boys, and if they're acting out and doing something they're not supposed to be, give them some swats and send them home. So we were literally raised by a village. So and people will talk about, you were abused. I'm like you. I didn't get anything that I didn't deserve. Like, everything I got, and as bad as it was at times, it made me the person that I am, because it instilled a lot of character in me. Like, these kids nowadays that just get sent to timeout, or like just the parents that just let them run wild, and like you can just tell there's no boundaries. Like, you're in public and your child's going just ape shit everywhere, and then they grow up to be these teenagers with all these really crazy radical ideas that turn into college students that are doing all the crazy shit. The young generation that we have that is either right at voting age or about to become voting age, dude, it is just chaos over here. I just don't understand any of it. And that's, unfortunately, we've had incidents in Tulsa where, things have got violent, and then you start hearing about the MAGA movement and how extremely violent they are, and this and that. And it's, I told Titty, like, I'm not so far right that I just think everything they do is acceptable, because there's a lot of things that happen that I don't agree with. But I feel like they infringe on my rights the least. And I just want the government out of my life. Like, we succeed. We revolted against the UK over a 3% tax. And I read something the other day that the average American is taxed like 42%. And I'm like, well, how did we end up here? You know, like that was the whole stand we made. I don't understand that.
Yeah, I mean, you made a stand for, I don't forget what it was. It was about 2p or whatever, so 2 cents. You know, you're arguing against, and now 42 cents in the dollar is ridiculous. And listen, I can tell you now from the UK's perspective, it ain't any better over here. The amount of tax we pay is ridiculous. I've got to chuck something in there because Big Titty's chimed in and says, now Shiner and I have our own custom Titty and Shiner branded AR-15 A2s.
Well, you never know. Like, I know how Titty likes those 22s. Well, and that probably seems crazy to you guys from your perspective that we can just walk in a store, fill out a piece of paper, and walk out with a gun. Like that probably seems insane to y'all.
Oh, it is. So yeah, when like say I went over to Texas in September last year, and my cousin said, you know, we jumped in his truck because he needed to go pick up a watch. So the shop that we went to pick up the watch from that he was having altered, there's just a load of guns on the wall there that you could buy. One of which had a picture of Donald Trump on it, dressed as the Godfather on the handle. And as much as it did make me chuckle,
in Texas, of course it did.
yeah. It's like, man, this is it's just poles apart from what I'm used to here in the UK. And I don't know if we had guns over here, I suspect that the problem, you know, with shootings and everything would be the same, because I do believe the level of respect, the level of issues, you know, would be a massive concern, you know. And I don't know. I'm comfortable living here in the UK. I'm comfortable living here in the UK when I know it's not a threat, and I feel comfortable that I don't feel compelled to own a weapon. So I don't sleep with a baseball bat under my pillow. I don't sleep, you know, there's no knives.
None of that.
Yeah, I never carry a knife. You know, we were talking about that earlier. You know, I was talking to some Americans who couldn't get the head around. He had a knife confiscated in the UK and couldn't get his head around it. But they take his head off him. But that was just perfectly normal to have. That he literally carries everywhere. So yeah, I'm quite comfortable with it. Now, if I were to move to the States, and would I own a firearm? The answer is yes. I think I would, just so I could feel that were the worst to happen, and if I found somebody in my property wanting to do damage to me and my family, that would be my last line of defense. And I would need that not to go threaten or take the lives of anyone. If I ever got angry and pissed off with my neighbor, sorry guys, I love you, pal, but you know, that I would do anything with it to that respect. But to have that last line of defense,
yes,
that is where I can understand why you guys would not want to give them up, because you know full well the bad guys have got them. You know, the good guys need to have them too. That's the thinking, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. Because, you know, if they came just, and it would happen just as you said. Number one, I firmly believe there's enough of us still here that believes it strongly enough in the Second Amendment that they ever announce that we're going to have a civil war of some type, because there's not going to be people that give those up willingly. But if they ever did accomplish that, they're just going to increase the percentage of people that become victims, you know, because if that was my job, robbing people and victimizing people, and I knew I had a 99% chance of going through that window and invading their house and not getting shot, and I had a gun, sure. Yeah, I'm going to do it. Like, I don't believe we can do that in a successful way and not increase the amount of violence in our society. I mean, I believe people have, especially as a man, you should possess everything that you can to protect yourself, your property, and your family. Not necessarily in that order, but those are the things that you should be willing to die for. And you should have every tool available to you to accomplish it successfully. If you don't, then are you really doing it right? I mean, we have the right to do that here, you know, exercise it, because there's a lot of people and a lot of evil in the world. And unfortunately, well, maybe that's another thing that's kind of got two sides to the coin, because unfortunately, the general public doesn't understand that. Maybe that's good in some respects, but I saw a lot of evil when I was at the sheriff's office, and it probably just pounded home how much I believe in the Second Amendment and people owning, a firearm to protect themselves. I saw a lot of it, a lot of times it was used in a really irresponsible manner. Like you said, somebody got mad at their neighbor because the way they were cutting their grass, and one thing led to another, and the guy ends up getting shot. And you're like, bro, was it really that necessary? I mean, what are you doing? And those, of course, those are the stories they run with. They put those all over the news.
Yeah.
But, it's, I think people, I know when I go in public, there's people carrying them in their waistband. We have open carry is legal here. You can carry a sidearm on your hip openly. Nothing anybody can do about it. We don't have a lot of people here that you don't see that very often. And usually when you do, like there in my local Walmart, I encounter this guy on a regular basis that's in there, and he's got a Glock on his hip, and he's making sure everybody sees it, and this and that. But I've watched him, and just because of my background and stuff, I've kind of paid attention to how he's behaving, and he'll get in a conversation with people, and he's always talking about himself, but he's so in tune with that. And I'm watching him, I'm like, I would have no problem walking right up behind him right now and snatching that gun out of that holster. His situational awareness is zero. And you're like, those are the people that, and the other thing Titty and I have always talked about, like, do you want to be that guy? Do you want to be that guy in Walmart when an active shooter walks through the door and starts lighting people up? Because he's going to see you wearing that gun and realize he's going to have to deal with you before anybody else. Like, I would never do that. Like, that just seems like, and that's of course you guys don't have guns. So that's besides the school shootings. We have these people that walk into, places they know people aren't armed and just start mowing people down with usually an AR-15. So they get a bad rap. But that's another thing. It's got so out of control in this country. When we go in public, I've always have in my mind, like, what's the quickest egress out of this situation? Like, how can I get my hands on the nurse and make sure I get her to safety, And we go to dinner, we sit down at dinner, and I'm always watching where I need to watch the door and usually have my back against a wall because I want to know if things go to shit while we're sitting there trying to have a meal. And usually I can construct a plan to at least get us out of the immediate environment, but I'm like, how unfortunate is that that's what we have to do when we go out now? Like, that's just incredibly crazy to me,
Yeah, it is, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I do enjoy being in America so much, is because I'm probably blissfully unaware of this kind of stuff. Don't get me wrong, I know it goes on. I've read the news and stuff, but I can go in. The worst is likely to happen to me in the UK. As I'm going to get punched in the mouth, or where I live, it's not a high crime area,
right?
Small town and leafy Cheshire, But we go down to London, where knife crime is really, really quite bad. The areas of London we go to aren't the worst parts, you know what I mean? We can go and drink. Like I said, the worst thing's likely to happen to me is I'm going to get punched in the mouth. So when I go out to a bar or a restaurant in the US, I haven't got my eye on the door. I've not really eyed up anybody else in there that I think is a potential threat. I can just sit there and have a beer and have a food, not have some food and not think about it. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or not, I don't know. The fact that I'm blissfully unaware of everything,
right.
I don't know whether that's for the best or not. But I can't get my head around in that line of thinking. And I think my wife can. She's a planner. She thinks about everything that she does, and I think that's what puts her off about moving to the States.
Is she scared of guns?
Yeah, I mean, yes, she is. So she the first time we went to Las Vegas, we went to a shooting range. And I'm telling you, dude, she is a dead eye.
Women pick it up, man.
Well, here's the thing. So there was four of us. It was me, my wife's girlfriend then, and my brother. And was he married then? I forget. I think it was his partner he was with now, and his wife. So we got a couple of guns. Now the guy who was supposed to be training us spent all the time flirting with my wife and showing her how to do it. So she had one lane, me and my brother and his wife. Okay, we were just like guys with guns. We took it seriously. We weren't messing around, except for one incident. Okay, and I'll tell you this, and this is a scary incident that we laughed about it at the time. And when I watched the video about it, I laughed, but at the same time, I promise you now, dude, you're gonna tell me it ain't funny. So my brother's wife has this pistol. She's shooting down range. She shoots. The shell pops up in the air, and you know how hot those things.
Oh yeah.
straight down a cleavage.
Oh,
Straight down a cleavage. So she's going like this, and she turns around to my brother to help him with a loaded pistol pointing at my brother's stomach. You know what I mean?
oh yeah.
So my brother at the time was a care worker. He's unfortunately used to having, weapons pointed at him. And literally he just bang, took it off her, disarmed her quickly and put it down on the side, and then proceeded to bollock the shit out of her off camera. We were filming it at the time. And it's like, we laughed, and I laughed about it at the time. I was killing myself laughing. I was watching it back. And then you think about it afterwards.
How bad that could have gone.
That could have been an absolute horror show. That could have been a news story. You know what I mean?
It did. And, that's the bad. The bad thing is you always hear about the negative experiences people have dealt with firearms. These mass shootings. You rarely hear them concentrate on a gun owner that did something amazing. And like we had a deal in Oklahoma City here, and a guy walked in and started shooting people. A guy in his pickup was driving down the road in front of the restaurant and hears gunshots. And he's just a civilian. He's not a police officer, nothing. He's just a civilian that owns guns and trains with them. And he probably thought that day he hit the jackpot, because he races over there, jumps out of his truck with his gun, runs in there, encounters the guy that's shooting people and shoots and kills him. And I'm like, if we didn't have that right, I'm sure you saw the news where we had the Muslim that was throwing Molotov cocktails at the Jewish people at that, that happened in Colorado, where it's extremely liberal. There's gun owners, but not that it's hunting, a lot of big hunting area there. It's not the concentration, especially where they were in Boulder. And if that would have happened in Oklahoma, I mean, the moment he started throwing that at somebody, or just got his arm cocked back to do it, somebody would have been running up and sticking a gun on that guy. Like, that stuff wouldn't have happened here. And I think there's a reason why we don't see some of the organized protests get out of hand, and we don't deal with it as much in the South. But I mean, and Titty had a good point. The Second Amendment made it possible for us to show the world that churches here are a safe space, because a few years ago they had a guy that walked in a church. Like I said, they pick places that they don't think people are armed, and luckily they had armed security guards that took his birthday from him for going in there and hurting those people. But it's there's definitely pros and cons, and I think as long as criminals are going to have find a way to have access to firearms, then anybody else in society should be able to have one to defend yourself, because that I don't want to go, like you said, go taking a knife to a gunfight. I don't ever want to be in a fair fight. And I definitely don't want to be victimized. No,
that is an interesting point, and it's one of the things, when I've talked to my cousin about it, about gun ownership, and he does say the amount of situations the police will deal with, and then the situations where the bad guy with a gun is stopped by the good guy with a gun, and and like we said, taking the guns away is only going to take the guns off the good guys, and that's really the best argument I would suggest now for keeping them. But there's something I want to move away. I want to move away from this kind of stuff, because it's important to talk about,
right?
And it is depressing. But like you say, you do something over there in the US, and we do have hunting over here. The hunts that we have are guys in red, white jodhpurs and red jackets,
right? Yeah, I know.
Yeah, shooting bourbon first. Well, not bourbon, but whiskey first in the morning. Scotch, I should say. That's me. That's my preference. And setting a bunch of dogs on a fox. That's hunting over here. It's a very, very different thing. But over there, guns are also used for hunting as well, aren't they? So just to put things into, so I know, we'll talk to you a little bit about your deer hunting and stuff. So I'll probably say, where we live about 20 miles from a place called Tatton Park, where you've got wild deer walking through. I wouldn't recommend going up and touching one, but you can get that close to them. They are tame. And I sent a picture. I might have sent it to you as well. I think I sent a picture to my cousin. There's huge deer, this huge buck. It's with his antler. Well, I could have been a female. I ain't got a clue what I'm looking at. But it was a beautiful, majestic creature. So I got quite close to it. I sent a picture of it, and he sent it back with a mark on it, which was the best place to shoot it.
That's besides being raised around my dad and firearms, as far as his job was concerned, he was raised in a household that his dad hunted. I mean, they hunted everything, rabbits and pheasants and ducks and deer. we'd go up to Colorado and hunt elk. And so, as I got older, that was, I was telling the story the other day. I actually have a pair of field boots that my grandpa owned. And when he passed away, that was the only thing that I wanted. I just wanted those boots. And so my dad was like, I'll make sure you get them. And so when he brought them to me, he said, what's the deal with these boots? And I said, hey, man, I can remember sitting on the tailgate of his Blazer going rabbit hunting. And I was so little, I didn't even have a gun. Like I was just going to start learning what was going on. And I said, I remember him explaining to me about how his dogs were going to run these rabbits. And he was lacing these boots up as he was telling me that stuff. And it always just stuck in my mind. My dad started laughing. He said, I'll tell you something crazier than that. I said, what's that? And he said, I can remember being little. He said, I probably had a gun, but I remember being little and him explaining things to me on the tailgate of a truck. And he was lacing those exact boots up. So, I mean, that was just a cool thing that, with hunters and hunting families, that to pass stuff down to each other is just like a gold medal win. But yeah, I was fortunate to be raised in a family that hunted. And I got, when I was younger, I was really into duck and goose hunting. And so I'd always have these wazoo tricked out shotguns, to go out there and bring all these birds home. But as I got older, I deer hunted as a child, and then I got away from it in my teen and early 20s. But as I got older, my dad and I got back into deer hunting together. And man, it's like you said, there's no other way to describe deer than majestic animals. The only one that's more majestic is probably the elk to me. But white-tailed deer, I have a hunting blind that is literally 50 yards from my front door. I just walk down this trail through the woods and I climb in this blind. And every day that I go out there during hunting season, these animals come in and will eat corn in front of me. And it's just amazing to me to watch. I've always said, like I'm definitely, I'm a religious person, but I don't believe, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious is probably the best way to put it. And that to me is the best form of church I could ever ask for. And I get a lot of flack online when I post pictures of deer that I've killed, and people talk about how like I'm a latent serial killer and all this other crazy stuff. But it's never been like that. Like I was always taught, like before you start, deer or field dressing that animal, you give thanks to the Lord that you had the opportunity, and He made sure that happened for you that day. Like you always be respectful of that animal. And there's people you run across, it doesn't happen very often, but you run across people that just kill stuff to kill stuff, and I can't have a respect for a person like that. Like I could go down there and probably put 8 or 10 deer in our freezer in a season, but it's way more than we can eat in a year. And why would I do that? That's not what I'm intending to do here. I'm just intending to utilize what I need. So yeah, the hunting community, and of course they're always big into the 2A movement, but the hunting community, God bless all of them, because they're usually dyed in the wool people that believe in owning those guns, and they're believing in giving. That's the one thing about that amendment. There's a lot of people. I don't think we could find a lot of people in our country right now that would be willing to give their life for the First Amendment. Like the freedom of speech here, that's kind of lost its luster for some reason. There's a whole generation that believes in censorship and all this other, not having their feelings hurt and all this other bullshit. But there's an incredible amount of people that would literally give their life for the Second Amendment.
Yeah, that's interesting. I tell you what you're saying as well. I think when you look at the privacy of speech, the freedom of speech rather. That probably changed, I think, with fact checkers maybe 5-6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the turning point for me. And there were people who bought into that whole movement, who wanted it. You know what I mean? And when they wanted it, they gave up a lot of stuff that they probably didn't realize that they were giving up at the time, and probably reflecting on it, perhaps don't realize what they've given up upon now. And it's interesting then this is, here's the question then. If that freedom of speech can slip away, and that was something that was really, really important, that was part of the American way,
Mm-hmm.
and say and be who you wanted to be, as long as you weren't dependent on somebody else's freedoms, you were fine to absolutely do that. And that's been sort of stripped away. And we've seen it stripped away. And it's the same here in the UK. You know, you see people go to jail for tweets, you know what I mean? Which is just a bizarre concept. Don't get me wrong. Some of the stuff is stuff that they shouldn't be saying and they should know better. But I'm not sure that jail time is something that, you know, what they need is an education, not I'm not sticking them in a place where they're only going to be around people who probably think the same way that they do, and it's just going to make them worse. You know what I mean? Do you genuinely believe then that there is no danger of that Second Amendment, those rights ever being taken away? And do you honestly believe it would come?
I think, you know what really, man, I've briefly thought about this before and probably made myself stop. But if I look at the generations behind us and the way they've been indoctrinated to certain things, common sense not being one of them, the truth not being one of them. But I think when that generation reaches to like me now in my 50s, I think there's a good possibility, probably before then, that the Second Amendment could be in a lot of danger. I mean, I think that younger crowd is bought into the progressive movement, and I think it might, you know, if something doesn't change and swing the other way, which Trump's trying to make it that way, but that it's eventually going to swing back to the left. It always does. I mean, that's just how the political landscape is. I think when it swings back the other way, we're probably going to have to really, really stand our ground on it, because there's a good chance we'll lose it. And I saw a deal, somebody had given this whole story, but the last thing they said in it that stuck with me is the message for the Americans was, if they take your Second Amendment right, they'll take your first. And he had laid out all these instances where it had happened. That's the other thing. You know, anytime you disarm a society, bad things never follow or always follow that. And a lot of times it's genocide. You know, like when you start unarming people, I mean, that's one of the first things the Nazis did. They made sure they got all the weapons away from people, you know, because it's easy to victimize people then. So that should make people nervous. Like once, you know, Canada, I've heard, you know, they came out with some really, I don't even know if they can own, I know they can't own handguns now. And I've heard crime has went through the roof, you know, because like you said, the criminals didn't turn theirs in. Yeah. But yeah, I think that the people that are willing to die for the Second Amendment, I think that's a dying breed, you know, like and that's unfortunate. I mean, because I feel like if you're a gun owner and you're carrying in public, I don't know, I have mixed feelings. You definitely you need to protect yourself and your family and those around you. And maybe that's all somebody's comfortable with. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you know, like I get that line of thinking. I wasn't brought up that way. And that's the nurse and I one time had a conversation and she said, you know, when we walk in a Walmart, do you know how we're going to get out of it if the shit hits the fan? And because there's been a number of mass shootings at Walmarts. And I was like, yeah, I usually have a pretty good plan in my head. And later she came to me, we were talking and she said, what if you got me out of there and got access to a gun, what are you going to do? I was like, I'm going to go back there and make sure I can save some people, or I'm going to die trying, because I feel like I possess a skill set that can do that. And if I have that, I have a responsibility to protect those people, you know, like that. I wasn't given that information and that knowledge just to tote around with me for no reason. I don't expect every gun owner to have a skill set like that. But I think if you do, you have a responsibility to go in there and save people, you know, and it's horrible that our society has to deal with that. But, you know, it's one of those deals that's a necessary evil. If you're going to have the 2A, you're going to have to deal with this kind of stuff, unfortunately.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one. You know, I can understand why the UK took the stance they did. You know, the firearms are a lot less prevalent here, yet they're still there, as we said. Like, you know what I mean? 50 homicides, 50 to 70 suicides is far too many. You know, to have a firearm used in the UK. It's you know, when you think that's about 2 deaths a week, and I don't hear those deaths reported on the news.
Right.
Some of them do. Don't get me wrong. Some of them do, but you don't hear it reported. And
do all your police officers carry sidearms? No. They don't.
No. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Have I ever seen I probably have in London, I suppose, you know, when we've been near Downing Street or what have you. But yeah, no, they don't. They don't.
See, I would think law enforcement would be a whole different perspective there. I mean, like a traffic stop, they don't have that for the most part. They don't have to worry about this guy could pull a gun on me as soon as I walk up to this window. Like that's the horrible part of it. You know, like when I was a deputy, you know, you can literally be taking rounds in less than a blink of an eye. Like, you know, you don't know who has what and who you're dealing with, you know. And you hear a lot about people saying police officers are overzealous or excessive force. And you got to understand, like, you always, you know, I never did not get that feeling in my stomach when I stepped out of the car to initially dealing with somebody, because you just don't know, you know. And I've always thought, well, I guess police officers over in the UK, that's not in the forefront of their mind, probably.
No, I like Stuart's just comment on there. I know, like they do, some of them carry. I don't know if they all do, but certainly some carry tasers.
I've seen video of that.
Yeah, and I don't know how many do and how many don't, or what the statistics are on that. But I know Stuart is he's a first responder, you know. So he's I know he talks to the police a lot. He's got a big interest in the police as well. God bless him. So in terms of that, then, dude. So I can understand why the UK took the stance that they did, and I can also understand why it would be impossible to take that stance in the US as it stands right now. Is there an answer? Is there an answer, or you know, I would like to say,
there's answers to the problem. There's definitely answers to the problem. Some of them aren't feasible. You know, a lot of people in politics that preach anti-gun stuff don't have a clue what they're talking about. Like they don't know anything about a firearm. They're not educated on it. They're just speaking about ridiculous things and claiming that they can do things that are impossible by the law of physics. You know, no, that can't happen, you know. But so I don't think that people like that are going to be open to being educated. They come at this side of it like, well, give everything up, give the assault rifles up, which that's a whole nother thing. But, you know, keep your hunting weapons, but give your assault rifle up. Well, you know, I've owned quote unquote hunting rifles a lot that have a much bigger round in them than a quote unquote assault rifle does, you know. Like, I don't understand the logic behind that. I think the best thing that is presented is the more stringent mental health, you know, background check. And I'm sorry, like I said, I'm a huge proponent of privacy, but I think that's one area that'll save so many lives. I don't have a problem with people looking at it. You know, I'm sure there are people that do. And I'm sure that if we give them access to it, somebody will use it for nefarious things. But on paper, I think that is the best thing that we can do at the moment. Like, because until we get a handle on the mental illness in this country, not just in the area of firearms, we're going to have so many problems, you know. And I think we have to address it from every angle that we can, you know.
Indeed, and for me, I think the key thing is what we've done today. We've had a sensible conversation about it. You know, I'm obviously being in the UK, we have one perception of it. You're in the US, you have an entirely different one. So we can have two different opinions, and we can talk about it sensibly. I can take your opinion on board, you can take my opinion on board, and you know, we can both learn from that. And I think that's important on both fronts. You know, in terms of whenever I see politicians, you know, I know that they have to get their point across. I know they have to come across in the media a certain way, but it is always important to listen to the other side and actually learn from their perspective. And one thing we will do is listen to our listeners. Stuart wants to ask a question, and he says, do you think there should be a limit on how many guns you can own at any one time?
Me personally, the way I feel, I have a buddy down the street from me. We were talking one day about Second Amendment things, and he's like me. He's very pro 2A, and he made a statement that I wish I could coin and take credit for. But he said, I don't believe that it should be illegal for me to own any firearm that the government has, so that I have the ability to protect myself from a tyrannical government. And I was like, man, nothing. I mean, I wouldn't go out and buy an F-16 jet, you know, but I don't have the need for that. If I had the need for that, I would like that option available to me. And I'm like, that right there. I like, no. So to the question about, do I think there should be a limit to how many you can own at one time? I don't. Like if you have the means to, and you can responsibly own them, you can responsibly keep them out of hands that are going to do evil things with them. Then no, I think, if you got so many guns, you can't keep up with all of them, and people are walking out of your house with them, and you don't even notice because you got 250 guns displayed. Then no, that's not responsible ownership. But if you can responsibly have a certain amount, then yeah, I'm all for it. I'm nobody, and I don't think the government should be anybody to put that on somebody and say, hey, we're going to dictate this as well. I mean, we did that shit during COVID. They dictated, and none of that worked out for us. Like, I told Diddy, like, I'm so mad at myself for giving up those liberties. And that's like this. Like, if you're going to exercise your 2A right, then do it to however you're comfortable doing it, as long as you can make sure that they're all safe at any given time.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, that's interesting. So the one point I'd make as well in terms of the US, whether they will ever get rid of guns, it can't, civilian gun ownership and ammo sales contribute over $80 billion a year
to
the economy, and the government will tax that and make some money off of that. And then they'll use that for whatever they want. Anyway,
the most powerful lobbying group in Washington, D.C. is the National Rifle Association. So they are very influential in so many areas of society. And I don't even think people realize it. But yeah, dude, it's, I read somewhere that like during the war, Japan looked at invading us. And they did it. They started creating a battle plan, and they generals went up the ladder and were like, hey, we got a problem because there's more guns in Michigan than we have in the infantry. Like they all have guns. And I think that's another benefit. Like it would be incredibly stupid for people to try to invade, unless it's during the Biden years when he just let them do it. But I mean, people are definitely going to stand their ground if we're going to be invaded. And like today, with as many people as he let into this country, that's a legitimate concern for a lot of people. Like, there could be a code word that that China sends over here, and all these fighting age, males that came in the country could rise up and start causing a problem. And we had the riots from the illegals that were here. The Hispanic culture rose up. And I told Tiddy a long time ago, when they put an end to all this, these people are going to revolt. This is going to be a problem. Thankfully, it's just been in our big cities, but that's another thing. We not just on a home defense level. Like if the country was ever under attack, we have the ability to protect ourselves. I think there's probably a lot of places that would have liked to have invaded us by now, but nobody wants to deal with all those gun owners.
True enough. And that seems like a good place to leave it. We normally wrap these things up around about an hour, and that's just exactly where we are. So for those of you who find anything interesting, drop us an email, share us your opinions. We'd love to hear them. And did you want to share where people can find the Tiddy and Shiner show? And where
you guys, the most engagement we have is on Instagram, and that's Tiddy_and_Shiner. And it'll pull us up. And we haven't been super active, and we've kind of been on a quasi hiatus from the podcast, but we're getting ready to hit it hard again. So if you guys feel like hearing some crazy opinions and usually some good stories, then head on over and find us. We'll keep you entertained. I promise you.
Amen to that. Like I say, I've listened to every single one of your episodes, and you dropped one this morning. I made sure I listened to it today.
Thank you, bud. I appreciate that.
It's normally down to me to wrap up this, but I'm going to leave it to you to give your signature sign off to a podcast, dude.
Well, hey, man, I just want to thank you for having me on again. It's always a great time when I come on, and man, I'm always so grateful to be able to appear on y'all's show. So thank you for that. And we need to get together, me, you, Tiddy, and the boys, and we need to figure out a time. We need to have one big show with all of us on and see how that goes.
That needs to happen, dude.
So other than that, thank you guys for listening, and thanks to Beans and the boys for having me on. You guys get out there, kick the day in the ass, leave your mark on the world. Shiner.